Hello and welcome to this week's Talking Points webisode. I'm Conor Wight. 2017 marked a new high for the number of European Union citizens leaving the UK. This comes at a time where the UK has seen their lowest immigration rates for over 4 years. Many believe that Brexit is playing a huge role in these migration changes. Brexit gained most of its support for its movement to regain control of the UK immigration policy and to reject the EU's free movement rule. Here with more are Talking Points analysts Payton and Michael Furnari. Guys, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So, like I said, there's a lot of movement, new numbers coming in, but people leaving the UK and people coming into the UK. The number of people moving in plummeted by 47,000 since 2016, and the people moving out reached a number of 130,000, which is the highest that we've seen since 2008. What are some of the factors driving these migration numbers?
Well, I think there's a lot of insecurity of jobs because of Brexit. People are not sure if they're going to keep their jobs, what the wages will be, and fewer people are actually coming into the country looking for jobs, which is obviously hard because if there's not a large job market at that point, they're not going to want to stay. And they're also not sure about their residency because of Brexit and like how the visas will work with that. So I think that's a huge factor.
Yeah, Payton mentioned that some of the uncertainty could potentially be pushing people out of Europe, but I think something else to keep an eye on is that people could be potentially pulled into staying into Europe because the current excellent job market in Europe could be incentivizing people to not seek jobs in the UK, instead stay back at home where their families are.
So there's an incentive to work on the continent in the EU past Brexit, and 130,000 people leaving the UK, that's not small change. So is there a risk that this is going to hurt the UK labor market? Are they losing workers?
Well, I think, honestly, with the quota system for highly skilled immigrants, that might be a problem because already they're having issues with doctors, having skilled workers stay in the labor force outside of the EU, which is obviously detrimental to their economy. But I think the biggest question is if they can sustain this declining. What do you think?
Well, Payton mentioned that things appear to be uncertain when it comes to white-collar jobs and things like banking, which have been talked about with regards to Brexit for months now. But I think people should maybe be a little slow to prognosticate doom for the UK job market. So basic pay growth quickened by 2.4% in the UK over the last year. So I think some of the people who have been predicting a slow in growth for the UK maybe should slow down a little because things don't appear to be quite so bad.
Right, so there are positives here. It's not all doom and gloom. And even if it was, sort of more negatives than positives, there are positives to take away from people whose constituents are the ones that, pushed it over the edge for this referendum, the pro-Brexiters. Do the low migration numbers work into the hands of MPs whose constituents were pro-Brexit?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about the Brexit referendum and that political process is that the grounds by which people voted for Brexit weren't particularly tied to numbers, they weren't particularly tied to a migration toll or even economic numbers. I think for people who voted for Brexit, a lot of it is about culture and a lot is about regaining EU sovereignty. So I think that there are very few short-term trends that really could move the needle when it comes to the opinion of the pro-Brexit voters.
I agree with that in the way that I think it's more appealing to pro-Brexit people, obviously these numbers, but it was more completely about cultural and sovereignty where it's not as much of an issue economically to them and why they chose Brexit.
So speaking of, how politicians have an impact on this, Theresa May has made a statement that she does not want to grant the same residency rights to people coming into the country during the Brexit period as were granted prior. The EU is pushing back on that. They want everyone to be able to have the same residency rights, to retain those after Brexit is actually finalized. Could May, turning around on her stance, agreeing with the EU, possibly sort of reverse the numbers on people leaving, maybe give more of an incentive for them to stay in the UK?
Well, right now I think her confirming all EU nationals in the UK right now to have selected status, they could go for selected status and stay permanently in the UK. It's like a huge push for them to stay right where they are, which obviously, we don't know if she's going to change her mind, what's going to happen in the future, but right now I think that's good for her and policy-wise.
Yeah, it appears like Theresa May, as she mentioned, is going to have to soften her stance on some of these migration issues because ultimately the EU seems to hold a lot of the cards with regards to Britain's future when it comes to interacting with the EU and all these different countries. So there's been a lot of pushback so far against Theresa May's terms to these negotiations. So it looks like she's going to have to soften her stance, and that looks to bode well for people looking to seek status in the EU.
Now, another stance that may have to soften her stance on is her stance on the customs agreement. She wants to take Britain out of that, and the EU doesn't want that either. They want everyone to be able to stay within that. She's receiving pressure because of how this could affect the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Does Britain stand to gain from leaving the customs union agreement, or are they better off staying in it?
Well, I think it's going to be kind of a difficult negotiation because in a lot of places Britain seems to want to have its cake and eat it too, where they want to be able to make their own laws, they want to be able to kind of determine their own sovereignty. However, in a lot of cases it seems like they still want to retain those old benefits from the EU and those old free trade agreements. So I think that's another position on which Theresa May in the UK are probably not going to get exactly what they want. So I think we'll see how it goes, but I would not be too optimistic if you're looking for Theresa May to get all the terms she wants.
Payton, your thoughts?
I agree with that completely, and I think it would be very difficult with this two-sided trade. It's very expensive. It's obviously a lot of factors going into it, so she's going to have to figure out her stances quickly on this.
All right, guys, thank you so much for being here. We're going to have to leave it there. And that's all the time we have on this Talking Points webisode. For more Talking Points content like full shows, articles, and webisodes, visit citrus.com and follow us on Twitter at CitrusTV News. Be sure to tune in next Thursday for a brand new episode of Talking Points. For Michael Furnari, Payton, and everyone here at Citrus TV, I'm Conor Wight.